Finland.
This meeting is being recorded.
Leah will explain the aims of the Churchill Foundation and share her learnings on models and approaches to increase values-based procurement. So this is our agenda for today. After Leah's presentation, she'll be joined by Alfred Deakin Professor Anna Peters, Director of the Nourish Network, the Institute for Health Transformation, and who is also a Churchill Fellow, for a discussion about their findings and insights. Then there'll be time for audience questions. We're aiming to finish at 1:45 p.m. So I'd like to take this moment to do an acknowledgement of country. As we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of all the land we work and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect, and to recognise the continuing connection to land, water and community. I also pay my respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking to you today, the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Let us know in the chat where you are dialing in from. So welcome. By way of introduction, many of you are already familiar with the Nourish Network, but for those of you who are not, Nourish Network is a multi-sector collective working to increase demand, availability and access to healthy and sustainable retail food. The Nourish Network is an initiative of Deakin University's Institute for Health Transformation, which is based in Victoria, Australia, and as previously mentioned, is led by Professor Anna Peters. So some general housekeeping if you can please keep your microphones on mute, it would be appreciated. I think we're all pretty familiar with webinar etiquette these days. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box as we go, and they'll be raised after Leah's presentation. Without further ado, please welcome our speaker, Leah Galvin, who is a public health nutritionist with a background in research and evaluation and stakeholder engagement, food system, social policy and regional community development. You can read Leah's full bio on our website under the events section, and there'll be a link put in the chat as well, so you can read a bit more about Leah and her amazing work. Thank you, Leah. So let me share slides. Excuse me.
Thanks so much, Victoria. I'd like to acknowledge the owners of the land that I'm presenting from today. That's the Malakati people of the Southeast Nation of Lutruwita, that's Tasmania, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to also acknowledge the Churchill Trust for awarding my fellowship, and a big thanks to the Nourish Network, Deakin and the Institute for Health Transformation for hosting today. Next slide, please. I can't see my slides, so I need to change the view.
No, I think they're coming.
Okay, great. All right. So yeah, next slide, please. So isn't this a marvellous photo? This was actually on the side of a building in Boston. I walked around the corner and so I had to snap it because it really was a big part of what had motivated me to be interested in taking the fellowship. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to present you with some background, why I'm interested in public procurement, a little bit of an introduction into what values-based procurement is. I want to share with you several models and approaches of places that I visited for today, and then give you a bit of an idea about what's next and what potentially might be your role in it as well. And then I'm looking forward to questions from Anna, and then any questions from people in the audience as well. Next slide, please, Vic. Sometimes when you're getting interested in something, you can remember the exact moment when it started. And for me, it was reading this quote from Olivia de Schutter in a report in about 2018. And it immediately captured my attention because at that point in time in my career, I was feeling a little bit frustrated and that maybe I was just tinkering. And so thinking about the scale of public procurement and how that might be a possible lever for changing food systems caught my attention. The next thing I did was buy a book called Institutions as Conscious Consumers, and that had about half a dozen chapters in it of people that were doing research and delivering programs, and that is really, reading that book was what really motivated me to apply for the Churchill Fellowship. So I was awarded a Churchill Fellowship at the start, in 2019, and that was to explore models and approaches by business and government that were increasing local food procurement by institutions. And there's a list of the institutions. Next slide, please, Vic. So why use public procurement for food system transformation? Effectively, it's a really great way to impact food systems because you kind of get to poke them in various different ways. It allows you to have impact on the kind of food procurement, the type of food that's purchased through procurement systems. It allows you to make choices about who you buy it from, and then also to think about how it was produced. So public food procurement is kind of this sleeping giant of food relocalisation and sustainability. Next slide, please, Vic. So if you want to know what values-based procurement is, it's really an extension of those three ideas. And the founding principle is that it's about spending public money to create public good. The number of times I heard this book during my visit was really affirming. So it's really about expecting more from public investment. And you can embed different kinds of values in supplier contracts. That's generally the mechanisms that's used, and the kinds of values that you might want to include: increase local sourcing because it can create economic benefits, improving the quality of food so that it's healthier and then you reduce waste, increasing the use of climate-friendly food to reduce climate emissions, because of course we've got an issue around the number of emissions created through our food systems. So that could be things like shorter supply chains, more plants, and then lower input production as well, so that's less pesticides, etc. Improving animal welfare, and then also increasing the diversity of suppliers that participate in the public procurement process, so small and medium enterprises. Next slide, please, Vic. So when I was planning my meetings and approaching people, I presented them with this framework of that I wanted to explore with them, particularly around the history and development of values-based procurement, some useful tools, frameworks and models, the how-to, including the enablers and barriers, and then also impacts from the institution and food system perspective, and then also on the climate if those impacts were known. So that was my introduction to people. Next slide, please, Vic. The reality is when I was planning this, I could have potentially met with hundreds of people during this trip because values-based food procurement is so widespread in the Northern Hemisphere. Which is really exciting for us. While we might not be where they are in the Northern Hemisphere, there's so much that we can learn from them. So what I decided to do was to choose to target people from a variety of different perspectives to see if I could get different lenses over that framework that I just shared with you. So this is how I categorised them. Basically, I visited with people that were program managers, people that worked in government departments. Sorry, could you go back one? Thank you. Facilitators and advocates, these are a really important group, researchers and enterprises. And you can see that these categories speak to each other, and that's generally because people have roles which cross over those different categories. Next slide, please. Just a quick dots on a map. These are the locations that I visited. So I was in San Francisco, I was in Michigan, I was in Canada and Vermont and Massachusetts, and then in England, Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Finland. Next slide, please. And that was over 8 weeks. Now I want to quickly introduce you to these 4 different models or approaches to progressing values-based procurement. They're quite different from each other, but they're all doing it very successfully. Next slide, please, Vic. So this is the sort of introductory model to the Centre for Good Food Purchasing program. It's a metric-based flexible framework that encourages large institutions to direct their buying power towards the 5 core values. And those values are environmental sustainability, valued workforce, animal welfare, local economies, and nutrition. For each of those values, they have a range of standards which institutions who adopt the program can measure essentially their baseline and their progress against. The centre provides hands-on support to institutions to help them with the transition, including they have great resources such as a large database of suppliers that meet their standards to support changes within kitchens. Currently, they're working with institutions that spend over $1 billion a year on public food procurement across the US. The photo in the corner there is Alexa Delich. She's the director and co-founder. And this organisation and model actually emerged after many years of advocacy and collaboration led by the local Food Policy Council in Los Angeles. And it's an example of how important that sort of soft infrastructure advocacy is in progressing these ideas around improving public food procurement. I'll speak a little bit more about that later. When I was with Alexa, it was actually only my second day, so I had my first epiphany second day. I'm thinking, wow, I'm peaking early here. But what she said to me is really, even though I was only interested in looking at local food procurement, that I should be more ambitious, that I should be looking at, embedding multiple values and trying to shift those concurrently, because that would be how I could have, we could have more impact on the food system, and it would be more wide-reaching. Next slide, please. So here in Toronto, I met with the Green Belt Foundation. They're a charity and their mission is to steward Ontario's Green Belt, which is about 2 million acres of protected land that provides clean air, fresh water, climate resilience and a reliable local food source to the Ontario region. In 2010, they established the Green Belt Fund. So this is a grants program. The money was provided by the Ontario government, and they, after doing quite extensive research, they had a good understanding around what sorts of approaches and projects would be useful. So they funded a variety of projects and research working with the entire local food supply chain. The businesses included entrepreneurs and startups, farmers and producers, processors, cooperatives, distributors and broader public institutions. The fund ran for about 8 years and delivered a variety of approaches and some great innovations that we can learn from. How they influence procurement through 3 really key projects. One was the Ontario Fresh, which is a business-to-business digital networking tool, which promotes and connects the Ontario food system. So it's essentially a platform online that's searchable, where somebody in a kitchen could find a supplier of a particular type of food. They can also find the people to look after their logistics. One of the other interesting projects they delivered was establishing an alliance called the Golden Horseshoe Food and Farming Alliance. And that was a network of people, again, across the food system. And they worked with 9 aged care facilities and in an 18-month period increased local sourcing by 21%. And then one of the other things they did, which was a bit more contentious but actually very successful, was invested in improving the e-commerce platform of a very large distribution company. And the objective in doing that was to improve the transparency so that people that were procuring food, whether they were in a kitchen or some sort of government department, could tell where the food was actually being sourced from. This is one of the significant issues with procurement. If you're trying to embed values, you need to have a better understanding of where your food's coming from. The light bulb moment when I was meeting with the Greenbelt Foundation was about prioritising investment in the middle of the food system, such as the distribution example I've just given, and also connecting the chain. So connecting people that look after distribution, that are processing and producing food, and kitchens, because sometimes people don't know what they don't know. Pictured in the left-hand corner there is Edward McDonald and Megan Sipos, who I met with that day. Next slide, please. So this model is completely different. Pictured here is Peter Allison, who is the director of the Farm to Institution New England organisation. It's a 6-state network of non-profit, public and private entities that work together to transform the regional food system in those 6 states. And essentially they're very focused on local food and increasing the serving of that in schools, hospitals, colleges, prisons and other institutions. Across those 6 states, they're working with organisations that serve 98 million meals per year. And at the moment, about $1 per meal is invested, which doesn't sound like very much, but in institutional meals, often the cost is actually quite modest. It might be $3 or $4 per meal. So actually that's a pretty good outcome. One of the really great things that FIND does is essentially they're about knowledge sharing and creating networks and doing research to inform decisions and to develop collaborative projects. They have a searchable database of over 400 resources. It really is incredibly extensive. If you're wanting to get started with what's gone on before, I would definitely start here. It includes tools and case studies. There's research, blogs, videos, tips and evaluation tools. One of the other very interesting things they do is work with young food systems future leaders, providing internships to build skills and networks. Their applied research is really important. It helps build momentum and interest. For example, one of the pieces of research they conducted in 2016 with 200 New England producers showed that about 60% of producers were not yet selling to institutions, but were interested in doing so. I wonder what that figure looks like here in Australia. They also found that if they were selling into institutions, that they had more land under production and that they also had higher gross sales. So it does actually improve the livelihoods. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the Lucky Last model, which is Dynamic Food Procurement UK. I had a meeting and a very delightful lunch, can I say, in Bristol with Chrissy and Rich from DP UK. This was about the halfway mark of my trip, and by this stage I've been hearing a lot about issues relating to supplier transparency, monitoring progress against values, and how we could include small and medium enterprise in the procurement process, because it's often difficult to navigate. And then, of course, this other big objective around relocalising regional food systems. So these were the issues which were challenges for some of the programs. So the DP UK model was first piloted in the Bath region. It started around 2017 or so, I think, and during the pilot, they delivered ingredients for 2.3 million meals. The reason why I'm mentioning these big numbers is so that everybody thinks how enormous the scale is. And it really, and that's of course the impact that you can have by targeting public procurement as a mechanism to lead a change in food systems. The DP UK model has 2 key elements. One of them is a thing called the Agile Chain Platform, and the other is program coordination to facilitate networks and provide technical support and advocate for change. So this online platform, it connects networks of growers, logistics providers, procurers and kitchens. It produces these really great transparent shorter supply chains. It consolidates ordering and invoicing, but kitchens can still be buying from multiple different suppliers, but they get a single order, a single invoice, and that's actually quite a nice innovation, because that's one of the things that people in kitchens find is often a barrier for them participating. Chefs can see who they're buying from and how the food was produced and what sort of standards or accreditations the growers might have and producers. And importantly, it also gives access to small and medium enterprises to supply for procurement. Interestingly enough, I actually was talking to a lot of people along the way, other people that I was visiting with, about this model, and there's now been some introductions made between the UK and other places internationally. So I probably, yeah, I feel like I've found myself being kind of the saleswoman for them, but I really do like their model very much, because it provides improved access to local, regionally sourced, freshly picked, healthy and seasonal food, and strengthens food security by increasing self-reliance on regional food systems and addressing the climate impacts of food systems as well. Next slide, please, Vic. So that's just a quick summary of the models and how they're quite different from each other. So the Centre for Good Food Purchasing, it has 5 core values. They have standards, technical support, a database and advocacy. The Greenbelt Foundation, of course, invested in a variety of different approaches, and they recommend concentrating on the middle and connecting various actors and building networks. Farm to Institution Network, they're about research, knowledge sharing, capacity building and networking. And DP UK, oh, sorry, someone's comments just popped up in front of me. DP UK has this bespoke e-commerce platform that links producers, processors, distributors and procurers and kitchens. Okay, next slide, please. So part of being a Churchill Fellow is committing to disseminate what you've learned. And today's obviously my first go at that. So thank you very much for your support and interest. Behind the scenes, I'm preparing a report. It's very close to being finalised. And this infographic is one of the key communication outputs as well. And it basically gives you a one-page summary. Right at the very end of this presentation, please take a screenshot of my contact details if you'd like me to forward you a copy of this. The other thing that I've been doing, next slide, thanks Vic. You can tell that I didn't have my professional designer do this one. This is something I produced. Because there was such a strong interest in the how-to, what I've developed as part of the report is a detail and the detailed case studies is a sort of consolidation of all of the ideas which I thought were really useful for us to consider in how we would manage to move procurement and some of the ideas which are and processes which are very evidence-based. So that's one of the things that will be in the report, and I'm happy to share that with everybody once that's been approved for sharing as well.
Thanks, Leah. Sorry the slides keep jumping back and forwards. My apologies.
That's all right. That's okay. I think I might be as well. And so the final slide, please, Vic. Next steps and recommendations. So I've just mentioned that part of the commitment to being a Churchill Fellow is that you share your trip findings. And for me, I'm going to be targeting people in government, industry, and also working with my sustainable food procurement allies. Working with allies, what I'd like to do is engage with government and industry and philanthropy to seek funding for several things. The first is a project around the initial opportunity and food procurement system mapping by state and territory across Australia. I openly acknowledge that there might have already been done some preliminary work or maybe perhaps very extensive work, and I'm not across it. I apologise for that. But I saw in several of the projects very elegant ways to conduct this mapping and how important it was and foundational it was for then developing what your next approach should be. The other thing that I think would be really worthwhile is to look at establishing a not-for-profit organisation with cross-sectoral governments to lead and coordinate long-term action with food system stakeholders and allies. Now, I actually don't think this should be singly for progressing the ideas around values-based procurement, but it could be something that has a much broader agenda around food systems as well. And the reason why I think this is really important is I just saw over and over again, particularly in the US and Canada, how important being organised as a group it is to lever change within government, because essentially with public procurement, you have to influence politicians because they're the people who make the decisions about how money will be invested. And then the other thing that I think would be really great would be to invest in state or regional based demonstration projects and to target social, economic, health and environmental food outcomes simultaneously. So, you know, based on that idea from Alexa is to have multiple values that you're working towards. And I think that will be really helpful. I mean, there'll be some things that we're doing well, and then there'll be other things that we need to improve on. I just also wanted to say that, look, there is some great policy support that already exists for progressing public procurement. It's not as strong as other places, but we're not starting from scratch. And I've included those examples in the report as well. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to shift to the questions now. What I'd really like everybody to do, if they could too, please, is to use this as an opportunity to share about something that might be going on in your state, or perhaps there's a piece of research that you think that everybody should know about. Let's use this as an information gathering session as well. And now over to Anna, who I think has some questions, and there's probably, hopefully, a few on the chat as well.
Thanks very much, Leah. That was really fantastic, and I think there are already lots of questions in the chat. And I just ask people, if you've got things that are mulling around in your brain, then feel free to either put your hand up on the Zoom or put it into the chat. I'm going to start with just a couple of questions, and then we'll move to those in the chat. One of the things that really fascinated me was, as you said, your first epiphany around moving to sort of those multiple values in something like values-based procurement. I mean, that does seem really attractive from an impact perspective and for getting more networks and champions involved, but it also does seem complex. And I know there's a question from Chris around, does it mean you trade one value off against another? And so I just wondered if you could talk a bit more in practical terms about what would pursuing multiple values can currently look like.
Well, I think what the point that Chris has made is really valuable. So it's not so much trading off, but when you look at the model that they use, the Good Food Purchasing uses, they have basically these different standards that you measure to see where you're at against each value. So you might find that in some institutions they would, I mean, once you've determined what are the values that are really important, you might find that actually you're doing quite well against some values. And so that's the bit where you say, congratulations, that's great, let's keep doing that. And then there'll be a prioritising around what are the other values that you perhaps want to make progress against. And some of that will be about making decisions about what would be easier to progress, so that you can get some quick wins. And then it might also be that, you know, there might be some policy levers that say that a particular type of value is more important, particularly I think in that climate friendly food space. That's certainly something that we're seeing more and more. And I mean, even here, I noticed the other day the federal government have a commercial procurement guide. That's probably not the name for it. I apologise for that. But it used to have in it, essentially it was just a, you know, best value, best money kind of approach. But as of the 1st of July, they now want, you know, all Commonwealth procurement to consider climate impacts and also how they can include small and medium enterprises. So I think we're in a dynamic situation here in Australia with the new federal government, and then also, you know, with some of these new policies coming out. Summary: start where you're doing well, start where you can make some quick wins, and then also start where there's some good policy levers. That's where you'll get good support.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to move to, because there's lots of questions now in the chat and the hand, so I'm going to alternate hands and chats. So I'll throw to Audrey, who's got a hand up.
Oh, thank you. Hi there. And I really loved your presentation. So interesting. I'm actually doing some research in something very similar at the moment. And I'm doing this research in childcare centres. And looking at, so I know it's not public purchasing, but it is a setting where, you know, thousands and thousands of children are being catered for. And we are researching exactly this, like local food procurement, seasonal, all the other environmental sustainability. But what I also captured, so in my study, I did surveys, I did food waste audits, and I've also done some interviews. I've also captured their food budget per child per day. And in the subsequent interviews, we've discussed this. And so this model is great from the benefit to the local businesses and all of that. But have you come across anything, or have you got any thoughts on the practicalities and the barriers from the purchasing point of view and the extra cost? Because what I'm finding in my interviews and in my research is that purchasing locally is a lot more expensive.
That's a really great point, because that, I mean, if you're starting this work, I mean, that's really the key driver for a lot of people, you know, that might be looking after the purchasing. Now, what they've found long term is that things kind of even themselves out over time. You might find that some things cost more and other things cost less. It also depends on whether a place is self-operating. So in other words, if they do the preparation in-house, or whether they're using an outside provider. There are lots of examples about how, as you transition over time, it is actually cost neutral, or there are cost savings, but it is a little bit contextual, but it shouldn't be a reason to not pursue it, because it'll probably work itself out over time. One of the examples that comes to mind is that, so at UC Berkeley in San Francisco, they made some changes there where they decided that the standard, that the people they were buying meat from had to have a certain accreditation standard. And so the meat actually became more expensive than the previous supplier they'd been using. But what happened in the kitchen was that the chefs then moved to using less meat and more plants. And in fact, the cost evened out. And so they're the kinds of ways that kitchens can adapt. But yes, you do definitely need to be looking at what those costs are and thinking about how you can make those adjustments so that there's not an additional impost. But there's lots of examples of where it's cost neutral, or in fact it improves the costs.
Thank you for that. And I suppose we'd have to find a way of convincing those, you know, that this will, you know, work out in the long term, because if they're making the decisions at, you know, from a cost modeling point of view, it really could pose a significant barrier to moving towards something like this.
That's absolutely true. And I think sometimes it's easier if you start with, you know, a single food type or single types of ingredients, build people's confidence up. It's not one of those things where you flick a switch and all of a sudden everything's changed. A lot of people talk to me about, you know, there being a transition process, and you really need to get some quick wins so that people stay with you on it.
No, I think you're right. And I think a lot of us would reflect on the importance of case studies in that sense, that capture those different stakeholder interests and values. It links in a small way to the next question in the chat, which is actually about whether you came across any good tools for evaluating the implementation of some of these programs. So they're asking, do you have access to baseline or post-implementation tools so that other people might be able to use those to also understand whether there's increased uptake for their programs?
Okay, so a couple of really good examples. One was, so again, I refer people back to that Farm to Institution New England website, which has got a lot of resources on it. In the report, I'm also going to share a couple of other places where there's a lot of resources, including evaluation tools. One of the most interesting projects, and it was right at the very end, actually, yeah, it was my second last appointment in Finland, and it was looking at a project which had actually been implemented across 7 Baltic countries. And that had been led by a university, so had really strong evaluation around outcomes. So that one's a nice one too. That's called StratKit. So again, it'll be in the report, and it's actually one of the case studies that I've written up. There are many tools out there for evaluating the success of these things, most certainly. And that's why I feel confident about the sharing the particular case studies that I have, because they did have good evaluation. So, for example, the Greenbelt Foundation, I mean, their return on investment was 19-1. So there are some really good strong evaluations that show that this is worthwhile investing in.
Yeah, I think they were particularly interested in perhaps the tools that they had used to come up with that return on investment.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so they had, so those sort of things, yes, I've got links for those in the report, and then also in the bibliography to a range of other places where you can find useful information.
Thanks, Leah. So just a shout out again, as Leah said, please do follow up with her afterwards if you would like copies of the infographic and the report. She's really wanting to deliver as much value as possible from her Churchill to everybody across Australia. So I'm going to throw to the next hand, which is Grant.
How are we, team?
Great, Grant.
So I'm actually a food procurement coordinator for a food relief organisation in Tasmania called Loaves and Fishes.
Oh, yeah, great. We love you.
And the reason I'm here is because I've only just come into the position. I've worked in agriculture for most of my life, and I'm in charge of doing up a food procurement strategy, basically, of what's happening and where we're purchasing things from, what we're using them for. And the first instance of that is we're working with School Food Matters and supplying those guys for school kids that are that are a bit more vulnerable and that need the help. So my question is, when planning out a procurement strategy, where's the best place to start? And I guess for me, like, I've sort of thought on it for the last 3 days, and I don't really know where to stop. So what should a strategy? Because initially my idea is that I'd have a basic strategy of what we need to focus on, where it needs to come from. It's obviously local. We can have a percentage of perishables and meats that are sourced all year round from interstate wholesalers. And then around that document would be other documentation like purchasing orders, donor database, grower database, that sort of stuff. Is that the right way to go about it, or is there an easier or more accurate way to go about it?
Oh, you sound like you've got great foundations there, actually, Grant. And I'd be happy to have a conversation with you offline in more detail as well, because we're in the same state as each other.
Awesome.
One of the things I've done in the report is actually to outline a process around how you do values-based procurement once you've decided to do it. And so that was actually that pretty picture that I showed. So I'm happy to share that with you as well, so that you can think through it. What I did was I based that around the model that the National Procurement Office in Sweden uses. So it's a clear process around how you decide what your priorities are, who are the people you need to work for, how you analyse and gather information that you need to make decisions, and then how you kind of embed that in going forward and monitoring and evaluating it. So yeah, I'm happy to share with you and have an offline conversation about that. But yeah, there is a clear process that you can follow so that it doesn't feel so overwhelming. And the important thing is to use information from each step to inform the next steps that you make in developing your plan and implementing that procurement process you want to put in place.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Happy to help.
Thanks,
Cheers,
Grant.
mate.
Thanks, Leah. So we've probably got time for 2 more questions. So I'll keep my alternating and go to the chat and then to Robert, who's got his hand up. And I apologise in advance. There's so many fantastic questions in the chat we're not going to get time to go to. But I know Leah's really keen to go through all those questions, so we will be saving the chat. And as I said, please get in touch with her, or she may also reach out to you if she's got your details in response to some of these questions. So don't be shy in reaching out, because these questions are really fantastic. So the next one I think is a really important one. It's about regulatory frameworks. It's from Amy, and she says, do the current regulatory frameworks in Australia prevent or make it very difficult for growers to engage in the sort of procurement you're talking about? She says, I know a lot of regulations are created for large scale producers, but then also applied to small scale producers. Does this apply for procurement?
Yes, is the short answer. However, one of the places that I visited was the Centre for Regional Food Systems in Michigan, which is a part of the Michigan State University there, and they had developed really good tools and processes for supporting small and medium enterprises to become part of these procurement processes. Because of course food needs to be safe, and there needs to be transparency around how things were produced, etc. So they had some training programs which they used with small and medium scale producers, and as long as you factor that in and build that as part of your approach, and certainly that's what I suggest that you should do, you can get all different scales of producers and processors involved in procurement. Is it easy? Not necessarily. It's probably easier if there's some sort of aggregator, so a sort of a business that sits in the middle of supplying to a hospital. So it could be something like, Food Connect in Brisbane. I can see you there, Robert, so I had to suggest you. Essentially, a group of smaller producers could supply to an organisation that's responsibility is to aggregate, see that the quality and the standards are being met, and then that delivers onto the institution. So there's a couple of different ways of doing it, but the skill building and the use of aggregators, those middle people, distributors, does mean that you can include all sorts of different scales of producers, or you could adopt that beautiful dynamic procurement UK model.
Thanks, Leah. That's fantastic. All right, over to you, Robert, for a 1-minute question and answer.
Thank you. So good to hear everything, Leah. Yeah, just a quick question around, we know in the States where they can use economic data, and Canada, to measure where food comes from. In Australia, because it's the GST system sells, it's really hard to get that sort of data on where our food comes from, region by region or state by state. Is there any tools that you've come across, or was there any countries overseas where they come up with a tool to really easily quantify where food comes from particular regions?
I certainly know as part of the initial mapping that goes on in some regions, there's a variety of different tools that they use to map the current food system. So that would probably be useful. They're of course applied relevant to the institution that you're trying to supply into. I think I've probably got a couple of things that might be interesting for you, Robert, so I'm happy again to have an offline conversation around that. That StratKit project that I mentioned earlier before, it's got some really great tools, a very elegant way of determining what the current situation is. And then there's another couple of other things that I'm thinking of that might be useful as well.
Great, thank you for that question.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Leah. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. I'm going to hand back now to Victoria to close off, and I'd just like to say my big thanks to Leah, who seems to have frozen on my screen, but maybe it's just my screen.
No, it's still here.
Great.
All
I was
right.
wondering if I could just give one final plug to the Churchill Trust. And I did put on that final slide, you know, a link to finding out more information. If you also have an issue or an idea that you're quite passionate about, I'd encourage you to look at that as a way to go off and explore it in way more depth. It's an amazing experience, the Churchill Fellowship. Incredible.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Leah. What an amazing trip. I did ask you before you left if I could hop into your suitcase and come with you, but maybe next time.
Yeah.
Such fascinating insights, and I'm sure I learnt a lot, and I'm sure others did as well. As I mentioned earlier, there'll be a recording and slides put onto the Nourish Network website for later viewing and sharing. And for people who did have questions that we didn't have a chance to get through, please reach out to Leah, as Anna said. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this webinar, so I'd encourage you to please complete a short survey, which will be emailed to you after this. And finally, thank you again to Leah and to Anna and the Churchill Trust, and also to Sian Norton of the Institute for Health Transformation, who is manager of the Refresh Centre for Research Excellence, for supporting our webinar. We hope to see you again for our next event. I'll give this a little plug, where we hear from Associate Professor Joy Parkinson of CSIRO, and you can find a link to that in the chat. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Victoria. You were brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks,
Be in
Leah.
touch. Don't hesitate.
Cheers, Leah. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Look forward to chatting.
That was awesome,
Bloody
Leah.
oath.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks so
fantastic,
much.
Leah. Nice work.
Thanks,
Bye.
Jen.
Yeah.
So great you could be here
Thanks.
today.
Thanks, Leah.
Oh, see you, Julie.